Thank you, Jody, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Mazzacurati. I am the founder and CEO of 427. 427 is a provider of climate risk analytics. I am calling here from California, where it's rather late at night. Where we're based. We're based in Berkeley. We also have offices in a number of countries, including a representative in Australia. And we are an affiliate of Moody's. We got acquired about a year ago. So my remarks today will focus on the use of climate data and analytics to support climate action. We've heard in Valeria's remarks, for example, about the challenge of turning those aspirational commitments into investment strategies, the difficulty of quantifying climate risk with sufficient nuances to support investment decisions and monitor progress. Additional challenge, of course, as Rosemary noted in her presentation, is also around time horizon and modeling future performance in a context of climate uncertainty. In that context, there has been a lot of attention put on scenario analysis, which remains very challenging for investors, for banks, for anybody who really tries to approach that topic. However, the regulatory environment is changing fast, and with that is coming a lot more guidance and data, as well as higher expectation as to what might be captured under the guise of scenario analysis. So I'll speak to that a little bit, both how expectations are changing, but also how data can support that, and then how it can be used to really inform investment decisions. And I am quite proud that I managed the clicker. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory context and what we're seeing coming. As noted before me, a lot of the leadership is coming not from the US, where I sit, but rather from Europe, as well as from Australia, New Zealand, Japan. A number of those central banks and financial supervisors have created a group called the Network for Greening the Financial System, known as NGFS, where those banks, central banks and supervisors are putting their heads together and trying to tackle those really hard issues of how do you develop scenarios, what are the right metrics, what are scenarios that make sense and are useful from a risk management and from a planning perspective. So we're moving from a world where for the past couple of years, we heard recommendations from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, that we should do scenarios, but that scenarios should be bespoke and should speak to the business model and the specific context of a corporation, which might make sense for corporation, but has made life for investors really, really challenging. In that they were not able to compare the output of the scenario analysis coming from corporations. Now we're switching to a world where the NGFS is putting together a set of scenarios with a lot of detailed underlying data that is really intended to allow financial institutions, banks in the context of stress test, asset managers, pension funds as may be required, to use and apply those scenarios across the board to their portfolio companies to be able to understand how their portfolio may be affected by those scenarios and really compare those outcomes. So what you see on this rather busy slide is a view of how the NGFS and also the Bank of England are describing those scenarios. There's 3 core scenarios, and those are becoming very consensual, and in my view will become how, at least in the next year or so, people think about scenario analysis, and then I might expand a little bit again. But we're looking at an orderly scenario, a disorderly late transition scenario, and then a so-called hothouse scenario where we don't take enough action and we see the worst impacts of climate change. Now, in practice, how do you turn that into actual data and factors into investment decisions? So there is no magic bullet when it comes to quantifying and understanding climate risk, but rather a collection of models and approach and indicators that can help capture the different facets of climate risk. When you look at transition risk, for example, there are models that will look at the construct of the energy system and what needs to change, which technology might be in the money, out of the money, which country, which company might benefit more or less. When looking at physical risk, where a lot of the expertise before 27 lies, we're looking at models that look at the entire Earth system and project climate hazards at a very granular level, which we map to company facilities so that we can then look at companies, listed companies, private equity, and assess who is going to be most exposed to what type of hazards looking forward. Then there's macroeconomic models that might help understand impacts on the economy, financial models looking at impacts at the firm level. And what we're finding working with our parent company at Moody's Analytics, and what we're hearing from the NGFS and the many academics that they work with, is there isn't a single model, but there is going to be getting signals and analytics from a collection of those different models that really help give you the full picture of macroeconomic and firm level impact, which makes sense when you think about it. You wouldn't use the same model for company level investment decision and macroeconomic drivers, but the same is true for climate, and now everything needs to be done again for climate standpoint. So once you get those models, what can you do with them? I have just some quick case studies here to give you some examples. So some of the things that we're working on, for example, with Moody's include what we call climate adjusted probability of default. So that's a way of quantifying credit risk for fixed income, for example, where we start very bottom up from looking at where companies' facilities may be located. Here I picked an example with a semiconductor manufacturing companies with manufacturing sites in Taiwan and on the east coast of China. We look at what their exposure is to future climate hazards using global climate models, GCMs, where we have projections for floods and sea level rise and heat stress. And those projections are then used to understand which company may be subject to volatility shocks or changes to the asset valuation that might lower the asset value and therefore increase the probability of default. And I'm simplifying here, of course, very complex models around expected default frequency and credit risk, but really thinking about how do we go from this shock on the company's operation from a physical hazard all the way down to understanding how the probability of default, the loss given default, the metrics that banks use, but also some investors use, might change over time. And the same type of approach is what we're working on to really apply to understanding impact on stock performance, volatility, both for physical risk and for transition risk. Last point that I'll make is switching gear. Another really important component is going to be to think about what are companies that are positioned to better perform in the event and as they think about preparing for climate change. And here we have the huge benefit of being able to work with a data set developed by our sister company, VE in France, which has taken a very close look and one of the most detailed inventory available, I believe, of how are companies responding to TCFD question. And here you have some statistics about companies in the energy sector and seeing what percentage of them provide governance indicators as recommended by the TCFD, so risk mapping, analysis of regulatory changes, going all the way down the list of TCFD indicators, where you see the cohort getting smaller and smaller as you get into those more difficult indicators around how is this turned into a strategy, how is this embedded into processes and systems in a systematic fashion. What's interesting, and we have a report coming out about that next week, is when you start comparing data on exposure and then seeing how this exposure is reported or not, and how well this company is doing in managing those risks. And so there's a lot of value in seeing the tension and the discrepancies between those different data sets. In conclusion, what I want to leave you with is that data and modeling are improving. We still have some major data gaps, both in our understanding of the economic cost of climate change, of what are scenarios that are really decision useful, our understanding of what are the metrics that matter. We also still have some big gaps in terms of transparency and in terms of having reporting that is really meaningful in terms of understanding corporate resilience. So expect this field to continue to evolve fast, but also realize that the expectations are rising every day, as are the stakes related to the economic and financial impacts of climate change. Thank you.